We're overproduced. We put too many song notes in a song, too many ingredients in our recipes, too many flourishes in the clothes we wear, the houses we live in. All we really needed to do was focus on the love. And he continues on, saying that he took a tour of his lungs, breathing deeply so that he could see the 2 spots in his lungs, the cancerous spots. And he felt, I went into my lungs and saw the 2 spots. They were no big deal. I was being told, without words, not to worry about the cancer. It's minor in the scheme of things, simply an imperfection of your humanity, and that the more important matter, the real work to be done, is before you. Again, love. And then he experienced what he called a brief death. I approached what appeared to be a very sharp, pointed piece of stainless steel. It had a razor blade quality to it. I continued up to the apex of this shiny metal object, and as I arrived, I had a choice: to look or not look, over the edge and into the infinite abyss, the vastness of the universe, the eye of everything and of nothing. I was hesitant but not frightened. I wanted to go all in, but felt that if I did, I would possibly leave my body permanently. Death from this life. But it was not a difficult decision. I knew there was much more for me here. Telling his guides about his choice, Patrick explained that he was not ready to jump off and leave his wife. The transition from a state where I had no sense of time or space to the relative dullness of now happened quickly. This is after he began to come down from his experience. And he says that he had a headache after that. But he also said to his wife that he had touched the face of God. And this is something that is apparently a very common theme with those who have had psychedelic journeys, cancer patients who've had these journeys. The experience of being reborn and the experience of seeing the face of God, for instance. The idea of overwhelming love, or love being the only thing that was important. And again, I remind you that, this is not a man. And these other people involved in these trials who have also talked about God, these are not people who are religious people. These aren't people who have even much of a spiritual sense or interest, if you will. And by the way, Michael Pollan is the same, the author of that book, who himself went on his own, very guided, very carefully induced journeys with psilocybin and other psychedelics. He had no spiritual belief at all. And he still says he doesn't really. But then he does. Because in having these experiences, it shows you what is sort of undeniable. And that it's not even about what you believe, what you don't believe. It's there. It's just there. So let's talk about this other gentleman, Daniel de Piazza. And by the way, this spirit molecule is called DMT that I'm about to tell you about is also something that Michael Pollan himself had an experience with. Perhaps we'll get to that later. It wasn't something he was particularly fond of, but there are others who do. And there's this small group in Los Angeles of people, of which this author, man who wrote this article, is involved, who use DMT to experience the sensation of death. Now, DMT is another plant-based chemical. It's a psychedelic, often found in ayahuasca. Also, I believe, comes from mushrooms, as does psilocybin. Now, these people use the term medicine to describe it, instead of using it as a drug. But traditionally, those who have used it in South America, and it's in its indigenous context, it's thought of as a sacrament, which is a medicine in indigenous culture has a similar meaning to sacrament. It doesn't have the kind of meaning that we have in the West of taking a drug to mask symptoms. A medicine, good medicine, when it's talked about in indigenous cultures, has to do with good feeling. But more than that, good medicine is something that transforms you, if you will. So Daniel writes, when used carefully and intentionally, this simple molecule can change your life and fundamentally alter your perspective of the world. But he warns, use discretion, follow your gut, and do your research before you decide to undergo this experience. It's not for the faint of heart. And as I've said, just to remind you that these things are not legal according to the federal government. So I'm not encouraging anyone to go out and buy, break the law here. Just talking about what some people are doing and what experiences they are having in the context of this show, which is to question, to talk about, to look at ideas of spirituality in a way that is not condemning, that is not that is not promoting or trying to disprove anything, but just to give it a presence for people to hear about it. Anyway, I digress. Let's continue with Daniel's story here. He says, I believe in God because I've met it. And I emphasize the word that he uses, I've met it. But the God I've met is not the Lord of any particular religion or doctrine. It's not a Christian, Jewish, or Muslim God. The God I've met doesn't have a book of rules for what we can or can't do. It has no sex or race, and certainly no white beard. In fact, this God doesn't even have a personality or any preferences. This God I've met is pure energy, the energy of the entire cosmos, outside and independent of time, in all directions, forever. You may think you can imagine something this vast, but it's impossible if you haven't experienced it. And so many of the people in the trials that Michael Pollan talks about in his book say the same thing. These are people who don't believe in God, but recognize this energy as that which people refer to as God. And they've had this experience of pure energy, of this entire cosmos. Daniel continues, in the past 5 years, I've experimented all over the world with different forms of meditation, putting myself in trances and other strange things that go bump in the night, including testing the effects of many different plant medicines. One of these medicines, DMT, the psychedelic that many refer to as the spirit molecule, is the active ingredient in the sacred brew ayahuasca. Scientists believe your brain releases large quantities of it when you're born and when you die. DMT is short for dimethyltryptamine. And apparently it is, it's a chemical we have in our brains already. This chemical apparently is what ushers us perhaps into the physical existence and perhaps ushers us out as well. He describes what he's seen using this chemical, DMT, as a death tube. The death tube is that spiral, radiating staircase that many people have described in near-death experiences as the white light. You know, when they say, don't go toward the light, stay away from the light, right? As you ascend this tube, he says, you can feel your entire ego, your entire personality crumbling beneath you and falling into an infinite sea. Your brain is a computer on the verge of rebooting. You're about to wipe the slate clean, and this is your Morpheus moment. Imagine the terror of knowing that everything you've ever thought, everything you've ever felt or remembered was going away, that none of this, including you, was ever real, yet being somehow delighted and utterly content with the irony of it all. Imagine feeling the full intensity of every emotion in the human catalog, from heartbreaking despair to tremendous joy. The energy, wisdom, and power developed over centuries of human evolution courses through you, releasing a choreographed stream of every color, image, and vision you've ever had in your entire life, superimposed on top of itself all at once. Every feeling of gratitude you've ever had, multiplied by 1 million. Every loving memory with your friends, loved ones, and partners, magnified. All of it tempered by the intense fear that it was all coming to an end, that you were soon to be no more, or that you never were. This, he thinks, must be what it's like to die. Imagine your spirit woven into the collective spirit of every other being that has ever lived or ever will live, instantly endowing you with the knowledge of every word that's ever been thought, said, or written now and in the future. Once you move beyond the self, all fear dissolves. It seems to make sense, right? Because where does fear come from? Fear comes from the ego sense, and the need to protect it, to hold on to it. Fear comes from the ego not wanting to disappear. Right? So he continues, just when you think you can't take any more, you will break into 1 trillion mirrored pieces and shoot through to the other side of infinity. Down the spiral, radiating white tube, you emerge on the other side into what I can only describe as a divinely loving celestial void. Except there is no you. There is the presence of God with no form. It knows you because you are it. I'm going to repeat that one. It knows you because you are it. It's a homecoming. It's looking in the mirror. The entire act is self-referential. You realize that you are God. The reason it's been so hard for you to see this simple fact is the same reason you lose your glasses when you're still wearing them. The reason you cannot see that you are God is the same reason the fish does not know it is wet. There is no judgment in this elevated place. There is no grand review of your life or